In 1911, a child was born in Romania who would become philosophy's most brutal pessimist. Emil Cioran, a man who made Schopenhauer look cheerful, who made Zapfi seem optimistic, who looked at existence and saw something so terrible, so absolutely without redemption, that he spent his entire life documenting the horror in prose so beautiful it makes you want to die. Cioran didn't just say life is suffering. He said life is an insult, a cosmic joke, a mistake so profound that consciousness itself is an obscenity, that we are biological accidents stumbling toward oblivion, that everything we do, everything we build, everything we love is utterly meaningless, and that the only honest response to existence is rage, disgust, the recognition that we've been thrown into a nightmare without consent and forced to pretend it's acceptable. He wrote in fragments, aphorisms, short explosions of disgust and clarity, because systematic philosophy is a lie, pretends there's order when there's only chaos, pretends there's meaning when there's only void, pretends there's hope when there's only the grave. Cioran refused to lie, refused to comfort, refused to pretend that existence is anything other than what it is, a brief flash of consciousness in an unconscious universe, a temporary arrangement of matter that becomes aware just long enough to suffer, and then stops, forever, erased like we never existed, like insects crushed under an indifferent boot. This is the truth, the only truth. Everything else is delusion. Everything else is cowardice. Everything else is the desperate attempt to avoid seeing what cannot be avoided. That you are nothing, that you will be nothing, that you have always been nothing pretending to be something. Before we descend into Cioran's abyss, understand something. This isn't philosophy that helps. This isn't wisdom that guides. This is pure horror expressed in perfect prose. This is what you get when someone refuses every comfort, every hope, every lie, and stares at reality until reality stares back. If you want to see existence without filters, without defenses, without the stories we tell ourselves to make it bearable, then subscribe to the Hidden Codex. Turn on notifications, because Cioran is the darkest philosopher who ever lived. Not because he exaggerates, but because he doesn't. He just describes, and the description is unbearable. Let's begin. Emil Cioran was born in Rasinari, a small village in Transylvania. His father was an Orthodox priest. His mother was severe, cold, possibly depressed. He grew up in a house where joy was suspect and suffering was expected, where life was endured, not celebrated, where existence itself was treated as a burden to be carried until death finally released you. This wasn't abuse. This was Romanian Orthodox Christianity in its purest form. The recognition that this world is fallen, that flesh is corruption, that the only hope is elsewhere, later, after death. But young Emil looked at this theology and saw through it, saw that it was just another lie, another way to make the unbearable bearable. There is no elsewhere. There is no later. There is only this, only now, only the meat suffering in time until it stops. He was an insomniac from adolescence, couldn't sleep, would lie awake night after night staring at darkness. And in that darkness, in those hours when defenses are down and consciousness is raw, he saw it. The truth about existence. That it's fundamentally wrong. That consciousness is a mistake. That being born is a catastrophe from which you never recover. He would later write that his entire philosophy came from insomnia, from those nights of total lucidity, when sleep won't come to rescue you, when you're trapped in awareness, when you can't stop thinking, can't stop seeing, can't stop recognizing that you're alive and you didn't choose it, and you can't undo it, and it will end, and the ending changes nothing, because it was meaningless from the start. He went to university in Bucharest, studied philosophy, read the Germans, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, the existentialists, and found them all insufficient. They still believed in something. Nietzsche believed in life affirmation, in saying yes to existence. In Amor Fati, Cioran saw this as cowardice, as desperate clinging to life because you're too afraid to see it clearly. Schopenhauer believed in will, in the possibility of denying will, in escape through asceticism. Cioran saw this as another lie. There is no will to deny. There is only meat, only biology, only the meaningless chemical processes that create the illusion of consciousness. And you can't deny what doesn't exist. You can only endure it, or end it. Those are the only options. In his 20s, he wrote his first book in Romanian, On the Heights of Despair. It's not a book, it's a scream. It's what happens when someone young and brilliant and insomniac stares at existence without blinking, and writes down what they see. Suicide is discussed on nearly every page, not as something to prevent, not as tragedy, but as a rational response, as perhaps the only rational response to existence that didn't ask your permission, that you can't improve, that will end badly regardless of what you do. Why continue? What's the point? What are you proving? Who are you proving it to? There are no good answers, only biological imperatives, only fear of death, only the programmed drive to continue. But these aren't reasons. They're just mechanisms. And once you see them as mechanisms, once you recognize that you're being controlled by biology pretending to be choice, the whole thing becomes absurd. He wrote several more books in Romanian, each darker than the last, each more disgusted with existence, each more brutal in its honesty, and Romania couldn't handle him. The Orthodox Church condemned him. Intellectuals were disturbed by him. He was too honest, too clear, too willing to say what everyone thinks in their darkest moments but never admits, that life might not be worth living, that birth might be a curse, that consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened to matter. So he left, moved to Paris in 1937, and never returned, lived in a small attic room, survived on almost nothing, refused academic positions, refused to participate in the machinery of civilization, refused to pretend that any of it mattered, and wrote, in French now, beautiful, crystalline French, aphorisms, fragments, short bursts of absolute honesty that leave you bleeding. Cioran's philosophy, if you can call it that, starts with birth, and birth, according to Cioran, is the original catastrophe, the fall, the moment when nothing becomes something and consciousness begins and suffering starts. You didn't choose to be born, didn't consent, didn't ask, were thrown into existence by biological processes that don't care about you, by parents who didn't consider whether you wanted to exist, who created you for their reasons, their needs, their illusions, and you're stuck with the consequences, stuck being alive, stuck being conscious, stuck being aware that you're temporary and that everything you are will be erased. This is the insult, the cosmic crime, that you exist without choosing to exist, that you're forced to be, and then forced to end, with no say in either. And what are you? According to Cioran, you're meat. Meat that thinks, meat that suffers, meat that deceives itself about its own nature. You think you're a person, an individual, a consciousness with depth and meaning, but you're biology, chemistry, electrical impulses in a brain that will rot. Everything you think, everything you feel, everything you believe makes you uniquely you. It's just matter configured temporarily in a particular pattern, and the pattern is dissolving, right now. As you read this, you're dying, decaying, moving toward the moment when the pattern breaks completely and you stop, and nothing of you remains. No soul, no essence, no continuation, just meat that stops being organized as you and becomes something else. Food for worms. Dust. Nothing. This is what Cioran saw and couldn't unsee. That we're temporary biological machines. That consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a side effect of complexity, that we've convinced ourselves we're special, meaningful, significant, when actually we're just matter briefly arranged as awareness, and matter doesn't care, has no opinion about being arranged as consciousness versus being arranged as rock. It's all the same to matter. Meaningless transformation, endless rearrangement. With no purpose, no direction, no goal, you arose from nothing, you return to nothing, and the brief flash of awareness in between is an accident, an aberration, a cosmic glitch that will be corrected when you die. So what do humans do with this recognition? We lie. We create meaning where there is none. We invent purposes. We tell stories. We build civilizations. We create art and philosophy and religion, all of it designed to hide the truth, to avoid seeing what Cioran saw, that it's all pointless, all temporary, all destined for the same nothing. We're like insects, he said, scurrying around, building little nests, fighting little battles, thinking our little thoughts, and then dying, erased, forgotten, meaningless. The universe doesn't notice, doesn't care, continues exactly as it would have if we never existed. And we know this. Deep down, in moments of clarity, in darkness, in silence. We know we're meaningless, but we can't live in that knowledge, so we suppress it, distract ourselves, create the illusion of significance, and call this civilization. But Cioran wouldn't participate, wouldn't pretend, wouldn't contribute to the collective delusion. He lived in poverty by choice, owned almost nothing, wrote books that sold poorly, refused positions and honors and recognition, because accepting them would mean playing the game, pretending that human accomplishment matters, that building a career matters, that leaving a legacy matters. And he knew it doesn't matter, knew that in 100 years no one would remember. In 1,000 years the books would be dust. In 1,000,000 years humanity might be extinct. In 1,000,000,000 years the earth would be consumed by the dying sun, and in the end the universe itself would reach heat death, and every single thing humans ever did, ever thought, ever created would be as if it never happened. Erased completely, no trace, no record, no meaning. This is the temporal perspective Cioran maintained. Not years, not decades. Cosmic time, geological time, the time scale where humanity is a brief flicker, where civilization is a moment, where everything you think matters dissolves into insignificance. And from that perspective, what's the difference between success and failure? Between living well and living poorly? Between creating great works and creating nothing? There is no difference. It all ends the same. In nothing. So why pretend otherwise? Why participate in the game? Why not just refuse? Why not just sit in your attic room and write beautiful fragments about the horror of existence and wait for death? That's what Cioran did. For decades. Until death finally came. He wrote constantly about death, not fearfully, not as something to avoid, but as the only honest thing about life, the only certainty, the only thing that doesn't lie. Birth lies, promises meaning, promises significance, promises that this existence matters. Death tells the truth, that it doesn't matter, that you're temporary, that consciousness is a brief interruption in the great silence, and then silence returns. And that's better, because silence doesn't suffer. Silence doesn't lie to itself. Silence doesn't pretend it's something it's not. Silence is honest. And honesty, for Cioran, was the highest value, even when honesty is unbearable. Especially when honesty is unbearable. He wrote, "We are all insects, waiting to be crushed, and we know it. That's what makes us insufferable. The recognition that we're nothing, that we pretend we're something, that we create elaborate justifications for our own significance, while knowing deep down that we're cosmic trash, biological mistakes, conscious meat stumbling toward the grave, and we can't admit this, can't live in this truth, so we lie, to ourselves, to each other. We build civilizations on lies. We create cultures of denial. We organize entire societies around the suppression of the one truth that matters, that we're nothing, and we're going to die, and nothing we do changes this. But consciousness, this terrible gift of awareness, won't let us forget completely. It keeps showing us the truth, in moments, in darkness, in silence, in those spaces between the distractions when reality breaks through and you see clearly that you're alone, that you're temporary, that you're meaningless. And these moments are unbearable. So we rush back to distraction, back to meaning-making, back to the lies, and call this sanity, call this health, call this normal, when actually it's cowardice. It's the inability to face what's real. It's the desperate attempt to avoid the recognition that Cioran couldn't avoid, that existence is an insult, that consciousness is a curse, that being born is the original sin from which there is no redemption. Cioran looked at human history and saw nothing but catastrophe. Every civilization built on lies, every empire doomed to fall, every achievement temporary, every great work eventually forgotten. We build pyramids. They become ruins. We write books. They turn to dust. We create technologies. They become obsolete. We have children. They die. Everything we do to create meaning, to build permanence, to leave traces, fails. Eventually, inevitably, completely. And we know this. Know that everything ends. That nothing lasts. That permanence is impossible. But we keep trying, keep building, keep creating. Why? Not because it makes sense, but because we can't stop. Because we're biologically programmed to continue, to strive, to build, even when we know it's futile, even when we recognize the meaninglessness. We can't help ourselves. We're trapped, forced to participate in a game we know is rigged, forced to play until we die. And suffering. For Cioran, suffering wasn't incidental, wasn't something wrong with life that could be fixed. Suffering is the nature of life, is what consciousness does. You're aware, and awareness is painful, because awareness recognizes lack, recognizes desire, recognizes that you need things you don't have, want things you can't get, will lose things you have. Consciousness is structured as dissatisfaction, as incompleteness, as perpetual wanting, and wanting is suffering. Having is briefly not suffering before returning to wanting, and boredom, when you want nothing, is its own suffering. There's no state of sustainable peace, no configuration of circumstances that eliminates suffering, because suffering isn't circumstantial, it's structural. Built into consciousness itself. You suffer because you're conscious, and you'll suffer until consciousness stops. That's it. That's the deal. That's what you got by being born. Mandatory suffering until death. Congratulations. Cioran especially despised optimism, hated hope, saw them as the worst lies, the most dangerous delusions, because they prevent you from seeing clearly. They make you think things can get better. that progress is possible, that effort matters, when actually nothing gets better. Things just change. You solve one problem, another arises. You achieve one goal, the satisfaction fades, and you want something else. You improve your circumstances, you adapt, and then you're dissatisfied again. There's no progress, just movement, just the endless cycling of wanting and having, and wanting again. And optimists refuse to see this, refuse to recognize that the game is rigged, that improvement is temporary, that every solution creates new problems, that you're on a treadmill going nowhere. They keep believing, keep hoping, keep thinking the next thing will finally satisfy. And Cioran found this pathetic, despicable, cowardly. Face reality. It's terrible. It won't get better. You're going to die unsatisfied. Accept this. Live in this recognition. Stop lying to yourself. He wrote about suicide constantly, not advocating it, but examining it, understanding it, recognizing it as the most honest philosophical position. If life is meaningless and suffering is inevitable and death is certain, why continue? What's the argument for continuing? There isn't one. Not a logical one. Only biological ones. Fear, instinct, the drive to survive. But these aren't reasons. They're just mechanisms. And if you recognize them as mechanisms, if you see through the biology to the underlying meaninglessness, then suicide becomes rational, becomes perhaps the only rational choice, the only way to refuse existence you never chose, the only way to say no to the insult of birth. Cioran called suicide our liberty, the one freedom consciousness has, the ability to stop, to exit, to refuse further participation in the meaningless game. And he kept this option available his entire life, like a trap door, an exit strategy. Knowing he could stop any time made continuing possible, gave him power over existence that existence didn't want him to have. But he didn't do it. And this is important. He lived to 84, suffered through decades, wrote book after book about how unbearable existence is, and continued existing. Why? He never gave a clear answer. Partly cowardice, he admitted, partly curiosity, partly the recognition that suicide is also meaningless. Changes nothing. You die now or you die later, it's the same nothing. So why rush? Why not continue observing the horror? Why not keep documenting the catastrophe? Why not write beautiful prose about ugliness? There's no good reason to continue, but there's also no good reason to stop. Both are equally meaningless. So he continued, out of inertia, out of spite, out of some perverse need to keep testifying to the horror, even though testimony changes nothing. And this is perhaps the most disturbing thing about Cioran. He saw everything clearly, recognized the meaninglessness completely, understood that continuing is pointless, and continued anyway. Not because he found meaning, not because he discovered hope, but because stopping is also pointless. He's trapped in a state beyond nihilism, where even rebellion is meaningless. Even refusal is meaningless, where you're so clear about the horror that you can't even find relief in ending it. Because ending it changes nothing, accomplishes nothing, means nothing. You're stuck, fully aware, completely disgusted, and unable to do anything about it except write, except testify, except document the catastrophe in beautiful prose that nobody reads. That won't matter. That will be forgotten. But you do it anyway, because there's nothing else to do. Because consciousness, once it starts, continues until it stops. And writing is what you do while consciousness continues. Cioran looked at modern civilization with complete contempt. Technology, progress, development, all of it is just distraction. just elaborate mechanisms to avoid facing the void. We build more, create more, accomplish more, and call this advancement, when actually we're just making the distraction more sophisticated, more comprehensive, more inescapable. Ancient humans had simple lives, simple sufferings. Modern humans have complex lives, complex sufferings. But suffering hasn't decreased, just changed form. We've eliminated some pains and created new ones. We've solved some problems and created bigger ones. We've extended life and made it more meaningless, because longer life just means longer suffering, more years of consciousness, more decades of recognizing that nothing matters. We've given ourselves the gift of extended awareness of our own meaninglessness. Congratulations. What an achievement. And relationships, love, connection. Cioran saw these as temporary delusions. You think you've found meaning in another person, found completion, found purpose, but you haven't. You've just found someone else who's also meaningless. Two nothings clinging to each other for temporary comfort. And it works. For a while. The illusion holds. You believe the connection matters, that the love means something, that together you're more than alone. But time reveals the truth. The passion fades. The illusion weakens. You see the other person clearly, as another suffering animal, as another consciousness trapped in meat, as another temporary arrangement of matter that will die. And once you see this, the meaning drains away. You're alone again, even together, especially together, because now you're aware of the lie, aware that connection doesn't solve the fundamental problem, that love doesn't make existence less absurd. It just creates another layer of suffering. Now you suffer your own meaninglessness and theirs. Now you watch them die too. Now you lose them, and the loss is worse than never having them. So connection is another trap, another lie, another way consciousness tortures itself. Children. For Cioran, having children is the ultimate crime, the unforgivable act. You take nothing, and you make it suffer. You create consciousness, force it into existence, inflict being on something that didn't exist and couldn't consent. And for what? So you can feel meaning? So you can pretend your genes matter? So you can create the illusion of continuity? It's monstrous. It's evil. You know existence is suffering. You know consciousness is burden. You know death is inevitable. And you create a new consciousness anyway. Force a new being to carry the burden, to suffer the awareness, to move toward the grave. Why? What gives you the right? What makes you think it's acceptable to inflict existence? Cioran saw procreation as the worst violence, the ultimate selfishness. Parents creating children to solve their own meaninglessness, using new consciousness as meaning-making strategy, while the child suffers the consequences, forever, until death, trapped in existence they never chose, courtesy of biology and parental delusion. But here's the darkest part of Cioran's vision. He doesn't offer solutions, doesn't provide paths forward, doesn't give you tools to cope, doesn't make it better. He just shows you the horror and leaves you with it, because there is no solution, no coping mechanism that isn't another lie, no way forward that isn't another delusion. You can't fix existence, can't improve consciousness, can't make meaning where there is none. You can only see clearly, and seeing clearly is unbearable. So most people won't do it. Most people will keep using the mechanisms, keep believing the lies, keep pretending it's acceptable. And Cioran doesn't judge them, doesn't condemn them, just observes them, like insects, scurrying, building, dying, meaningless motion in meaningless time. And he documents it, writes it down, in beautiful prose that makes horror aesthetic, That makes suffering artistic. That transforms the unbearable into literature. Not because literature makes it better, but because it's what consciousness does. Makes form from chaos, creates beauty from ugliness, transforms suffering into expression, for no reason, to no purpose, just because it can. Just because consciousness, once it starts, continues creating until it stops. Cioran lived in his tiny attic room in Paris for decades, wrote in cafes, walked alone, spoke to few people, had no career, no position, no status, no achievements by conventional measures, just books. Beautiful, poisonous books that almost nobody read, that sold poorly, that were critically ignored, and he didn't care, because caring would mean participating, would mean believing that recognition matters, that influence matters, that leaving a mark matters, and he knew it doesn't matter, knew his books would be forgotten, knew he would be forgotten, knew that writing them was as meaningless as not writing them. But he wrote anyway, because what else do you do while waiting to die? You write, or you don't write. Both are meaningless. But writing at least fills time, gives consciousness something to do, creates the illusion of purpose while you move toward the grave. He died in 1995, in Paris, at 84, after decades of documenting horror, after a lifetime of refusing comfort, after writing book after book that nobody read. And what did his life accomplish? Nothing. What did his work change? Nothing. What did his honesty achieve? Nothing. He saw this coming, predicted it, accepted it. His entire philosophy is validated by his own insignificance, by the fact that he was right, that it didn't matter, that he was erased, that he's forgotten, that we're all insects, waiting to be crushed, scurrying meaninglessly until the boot comes down. And the boot always comes down. For everyone, for everything. That's the only guarantee, the only certainty, the only truth that doesn't lie. If this philosophy speaks to you, if you recognize the horror Cioran documented, if you're tired of comfortable lies and want brutal honesty, then subscribe to the Hidden Codex, because we don't make existence better. We don't offer hope. We don't provide solutions. We just show you what the darkest thinkers saw, what they couldn't unsee, what they documented for the few who are willing to look. Next time, we'll explore something even darker, if that's possible. Until then, sit with what Cioran revealed, that you're meat, that you're temporary, that you're meaningless, that you'll be erased, completely, like you never existed, like an insect crushed under a boot, and nobody will remember, nobody will care. The universe will continue exactly as it would have if you never lived. That's the truth, the only truth. Everything else is lies we tell ourselves to make the unbearable bearable. But Cioran wouldn't lie, wouldn't comfort, wouldn't pretend. He just documented the horror, in beautiful prose, for no reason, to no purpose, because that's what consciousness does. Suffers, expresses its suffering, and then stops. That's it. That's all there is. Brief consciousness. Meaningless suffering. Inevitable erasure. Welcome to existence. Congratulations on being born. Now suffer until you die. Then be forgotten. Completely. Forever. Like you never were. Like an insect. Like nothing. Because that's what you are. That's what we all are. Nothing pretending to be something. Meat pretending to matter. Consciousness pretending it's significant. Until death reveals the truth, that it was all pretend, all lie, all desperate denial of the obvious, that we're biological accidents, cosmic trash, temporary configurations of matter, that will dissolve, return to nothing, be erased, completely, and the universe won't notice, won't care, won't remember, will continue its meaningless motion, forever, indifferent. That's Cioran. That's the truth. That's what awaits you. Nothing. Welcome to the void.